International Council National Capital Branch to be with you all this evening, as we are assembled to discuss a subject so inherent to our culture and identity as Canadians: reconciliation with Indigenous peoples through the ongoing work of the Anglican Church of Canada. My name is Elizabeth Kingston, the president of the CIC National Capital Branch, and we are one of 18 branches across Canada. This session marks the beginning of a series on reconciliation-focused initiatives by the CIC, with a session to be held in Thunder Bay with Sabrina Whitman, a Mi'kmaq activist and coordinator of Indigenous Affairs at Acadia University, followed by a session offered by the Quebec branch on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We are most grateful for the presence this evening of the Most Reverend Mark MacDonald, Judith Moses, and the Venerable Dr. J. Koyle. Thank you all very much for your participation. The Most Reverend Mark MacDonald has been the National Indigenous Anglican Archbishop of the Anglican Church since 2007, after 10 years as a Bishop of Alaska. He also served in Navajo Land, Red Lake Nation in Minnesota, and an urban indigenous ministry in Portland, Oregon. His academic training was at the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota, Wycliffe College in Toronto, and Church Divinity School of the Pacific. He is a North American president of the World Council of Churches. Archbishop MacDonald is also the author of numerous publications, including Native American Youth Ministries, co-authored with Dr. Carol Hampton, and published in Resource Book for Ministries with Youth and Young Adults by the Episcopal Church Center. And he also contributed to the publication Green Shoots Out of Dry Land, Growing a New Future for the Church in Canada. Welcome, Archbishop Mark. Judith Moses is the chair of the Jubilee Commission and lay prolocutor of the Anglican Church of Canada, and was born on the Six Nations Reserve. Judith has occupied senior positions in both federal and provincial governments in both Indigenous and non-Indigenous fields, as well as at the United Nations. She stood for Parliament in 2008 and provincially in 2009. She was a former vice president with the Institute on Governance, where she specialized in governance and transformational change in government boards and agencies. She currently consults on Indigenous issues in the health, dispute resolution, environment, education, and health and suicide prevention fields. Welcome, Judith. Our moderator this evening is the Venerable Dr. J. Koyle, the Executive Archdeacon and Executive Officer for the Anglican Diocese of Algoma. The diocese is blessed with a unique and historically rich setting in which First Nations, Métis, and non-Indigenous peoples may engage in cross-cultural dialogue, advance the process of reconciliation, and forge a new way of living together. Jay served as diocesan liaison to the 2018 Shingwat Gathering and Conference, the Government Apology, and the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. Then and now, he holds a doctoral degree in homiletics and completed graduate work in liturgical studies at the University of Notre Dame. Welcome, Jay. Please submit any questions you may have in the Q&A prompt at the bottom of the screen. We will do our best to answer as many as we can in the time allotted. I would like to say that this session is of particular personal meaning for me. My grandfather, the Right Reverend George Frederick Kingston, served as bishop in the Diocese of Algoma from 1940 to 1944. He was then primate of all Canada and Archbishop of Nova Scotia from 1947 to 1950, all at the time of the residential schools. Many thanks to you all, and Jay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Liz, and I will only occupy the floor for a very brief time because I know it's Archbishop Mark and Judith that we want to hear from this evening. I'll just mention that first of all, I am speaking from Bawating, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Bawating, as I understand it, means the gathering place by the rapids. And this is Huron-Robinson Treaty Territory and the traditional land of the Anishinaabe. Before I say more about this context, which is a very exciting context to be in at this present time. I want to acknowledge too that amongst the people listening in this evening are the former primate of Canada and now one of the assisting bishop in the Diocese of Moosonee, and that is Primate Fred Hiltz, the Archbishop Fred Hiltz. So Archbishop Fred, it's lovely to have you here this evening, and don't be surprised if somebody asks for your input on something as they're moving along, if that's all right. Also listening in this evening is the Archbishop of Ontario and the Bishop of this diocese and the Diocese of Moosonee, and that is Archbishop Anne Germond. So I have to behave myself this evening because my superior is watching. This is an exciting area to be serving in because of a number of reasons, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about all of it, but I just want to share that one of the exciting things here is the Shingwauk Residential School Center. There were 2 residential schools here in Sault Ste. Marie over the years. One of them is now the site of Algoma University, and within that, the Shingwauk Residential School Center is a cross-cultural research and educational project of the university and also of the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association. And so it includes former students of the residential schools, staff, descendants, family, friends. And so that's a very rich context where a lot of exciting things are happening. There's the first permanent and it's an award-winning exhibit about residential schools that was driven by survivors. And it's if you're ever in this area, it's an exhibit not to be missed. Also, the group works working with survivor groups, church entities, educators, First Nations, and others to research and collect and preserve and display the history of residential and day schools across Canada. So it's a very exciting project that's happening here in terms of the residential school center. We're also the site of the Shingwauk Kinamajkamig, which is a post-secondary education geared specifically towards Indigenous students. And it's committed to restoring the original spirit and intent of Chief Shingwauk, who envisioned a teaching wigwam where his people could acquire the necessary educational tools in modern society without compromising their culture and their traditions, and where they could also offer to settlers the insights from their culture and their values and traditions. And so that's another exciting project here. And we're partnering as a diocese in both of these initiatives because we're part of the Shingwauk Trust. The last thing I'll point out is the historic Sault Ste. Marie Métis Council here is establishing, as I understand it, Ontario's only Métis Cultural Center in a former building of the diocese. When 2 of our churches merged, that building and that land was restored to the Métis because we discovered it was a burial ground, had been from centuries ago. And so there's a lot of exciting things happening here, and I suspect that's just indicative of a lot of the exciting things happening across the country. I think as we move ahead with our presentation, I'll keep an eye on the chat and on the Q&A, but I'll turn things over to Judith to get us started on the topic this evening.
Thank you, Jay. And thank you to Liz and the CIC for the invitation to be with you this evening. Mark, both Archbishop Mark and I truly appreciate your interest in this. Just to be clear, though, what we're going to be sharing with you tonight is only a slice of a broader Canadian story on reconciliation. And we as a church are still in the early days of our journey on reconciliation. Just a bit of background on who we are. We're about 1,700 individual churches or parishes across the country, organized in about 30 dioceses, each led by a bishop. So in a sense, we're not one organization, but actually 3 legally separate entities that come together every 3 years in what we call our General Synod. So you can imagine the challenges, and those of you in Ottawa understand federal-provincial relations, and it's not unlike the challenge of getting people to work together. The Anglican Church of Canada is moving forward on reconciliation in a number of ways. Our goal is to establish what Indigenous people call right relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Anglicans. And these relations are being defined by Indigenous Anglicans. And Archbishop Mark is going to talk to you about the work that he's doing. So the church is committed to truth-telling about past injustices. For us, this has involved very extensive listening processes, apologies, repentance, as well as providing restitution and healing from the trauma caused by the Indian residential schools. Today, the Anglican journey does involve unconditional support for the principle of self-determination for Indigenous Anglicans. And that is as per the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We in the church have put in place governance arrangements to underpin all of this. We have our own Indigenous Archbishop, Mark. We have a Sacred Circle, which is an organization of all Indigenous Anglicans, and it has an elected body called the Anglican Council of Indigenous People. And our arrangements are supported in a legal framework for us called canon law. So the biggest challenge, I would say, for us is really trying to unlearn the colonial history that shaped who we are as a church and how we got to where we are today. While that is uncomfortable for many non-Indigenous folks, for many Indigenous people, unlearning is difficult. It involves, for many people, reliving a history of trauma, of violence, facing up to broken promises, and living with the daily social ills that go with having been second-class citizens in Canada. It's a tough journey. Healing and recovery from a demeaned culture, relearning traditional languages, which in my case, I was never taught my language. Resurrecting traditional forms of governance and integrating our traditional spirituality into the Anglican worship. These are all examples of some of the things that we face. The Church of England, as a state church, played a large historical role in the settling of the country and damage caused to Indigenous people. So, of course, it's only right that the Anglican Church should step up to the plate and try to put things right. The first residential school was Anglican. It was established in 1828, I think, funded by the federal government. You've all heard that horrible mandate that was given by the Prime Minister then about killing the Indian and the child and eradicating the savage heathen life. Those were policy in those days. The result of the residential schools was obviously severe damage to Indigenous people. And we still see that manifested today in the social problems that are caused by intergenerational trauma. Indigenous people have been on a collision course with colonialism since Columbus. I highly commend the Anglican Church's video called Doctrine of Discovery, Stolen Lands, Strong Hearts. It was produced by the Indigenous Church, and it elaborates more on our history. I believe Liz sent out the link to that to all of you. The early beginnings of capitalism in North America were founded on an ideology derived from the doctrine of discovery. It supported Christian domination and superiority in Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and of course, the Americas. White supremacy and dehumanizing of the original inhabitants was necessary to support the divine right of the Christian sovereign and settlers to discover, occupy, and reap the resources of the land. So the doctrine of discovery provided the legal and moral justification for disenfranchising Indigenous peoples from the lands that we occupied. In Canada, the French and English also developed the concept of terra nullius to further substantiate the assertion of sovereignty. This meant that land could be regarded as empty, so that title to it could be claimed. So while Indigenous right to occupy and use land was allowed through treaties, starting with the Royal Proclamation of 1763, to this day, these lands are held in trust by the Crown. From early on, we have had different worldviews at play. One that rights and pre-colonial civilization and cultures existed prior to European arrival, and the other, as we know, that the discoverer had inalienable rights to the land and all of its bounty. Indigenous people interpreted the Royal Proclamation and the Treaty of Niagara as acknowledging the right to self-determination, and that it underpinned the establishment of a nation-to-nation relationship in which neither group gave up any sovereignty. And Indigenous people believe that this was expressed through the covenant chain and the two-row wampum that it is believed to this day communicated the concept of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people walking side by side and not interfering with each other's affairs. And behind it were Indigenous concepts of respect, friendship, and peace. And as we, I'm sure, are well aware that the solemnity of the treaties to Indigenous people that followed has been honored more in the breach than in practice. So the hard truth, I think, of our real history is difficult for Canadians to face. The regard for the original peoples has been and continues to be trumped by white acquisition of wealth, beginning with the fur trade, the fishery, and all the other resources. And we all are aware to this day, I think hardly a week or a day goes by when we don't hear about some conflict somewhere in the country over land and water use. So as I said, sadly, the Anglican Church did play a large role in frontier life. And while we can't rewrite the history of past injustices, we can face up to the past and we can acknowledge the other side of the story. The Church has recently launched a project to tell the Church's history from an Indigenous perspective. And this is The Missing Story. And I'm proud to be leading that project. Coming out of this, we hope that we can forge a new narrative about our past that will help the whole Church walk together forward into the future. There are many more things I could elaborate on and go into, but I want to turn this over to Archbishop Mark MacDonald to talk about his experience. And he's been involved since very early on in some of the changes that have been involved in building our Indigenous Church.
Thank you very much, Judith. And I want to greet everybody here as relatives, which is the respectful way that our elders tell us to greet people. I think that a number of years ago, I was asked to talk about the future. And I said that the first thing that will happen in the future is that we will get a new past. By that, I don't mean that we will lose sight of the painful aspects of the past. I think, in fact, we will see deeper aspects of some of that pain. But I think that we will also see Indigenous agency emerge out of this, a story that the two primary narratives that we have heard about Indigenous people, one that I would identify as the anthropologist story, and the other that I would identify as the missionary story, this will emerge. I think that the anthropologists have never really been interested in Indigenous people who have kind of merged an Indigenous cosmology with interest in Christian ideas and thought. The Church, of course, was really upset that Indigenous people merged their cosmology with Christian ideas. And of course, what happened is they had to kind of hide it from both folks, and especially the government. It should be remembered that it was illegal up until the 1960s for Indigenous people to practice their traditional religion. And so even someone who was a baptized Christian who practiced traditional forms of spirituality was flirting with danger. So a lot of people hid it, even people who were outwardly Christian, and they lived in a world that was touched by two things, and I think this is important. So we must begin to understand that Indigenous people were shaping an understanding of Christian faith and what we would call the gospel, and the ideas that missionaries brought from the very beginning. And one of our first Indigenous missionaries, a person called Henry Budd, he said in the 1850s, this is really not going to go anywhere until we are in charge of our own affairs. And that really is a project that has taken a long time. It's still happening now. The Robert Schreider, who's a Roman Catholic theologian, he said reconciliation happens when people who have been wronged move from being victims to being survivors. What happens is that they reclaim their humanity. He points out, and this is an echo of something that Martin Luther King said with a little more homiletic flourish, but he said reconciliation does not happen because of people who have been oppressing someone or benefiting from that oppression wake up someday and say, gee, you know, we've been pretty bad to those folks. We should start being better. What happens is that people wake up and decide, I do not deserve this. I am going to change things for the better. This process was going on for quite a while. It had to be hidden, and it began to emerge all across what we would call Turtle Island. In the 1950s, elders in their own languages began to say, we must have our own church. And they began to insist upon it. They began to dream of formation and training operated by themselves. They began to dream of clergy trained by them. They began to dream of bishops, and they began to dream of a church that operated not on the basis of Western procedures and law, but a church that operated by a merging of their law and procedures and protocols and a merging of the Christian values and ideals that they had grown to love and appreciate. And so they began to urge them in this direction. And this is the process that we're in. It began to really pick up speed in 1988 and in the first Sacred Circle. And it has grown since then. An apology by our primate in 2003, a covenant that came out in 2004, and then gradually over time, a number of expressions that have too many events to cover now have come together to articulate a way of being Anglican Indigenous Christians. And this is been difficult for many Anglican non-Indigenous people to understand, but it's been difficult for Indigenous Anglicans to understand because they have been also been so trained by the doctrine of discovery and this kind of systemic pool of thought that infects life in Western society and the global culture of money, that they, an Indigenous person said to me, because I was talking about how we would see the flourishing of Indigenous law in this Indigenous church that was forming, and an Indigenous person said, "We had law," and you see, of course, non-Indigenous people, part of the perspective that was used as a way of taking over, and unfortunately, the church was part of that framing. Was to say these people were so and the word was often used, demonic, that they had no law, that they had no sign of civilization. And there are many people today, John Burroughs among them, Basil Johnson, who used to be at ROM. These people have been able to articulate in a spectacular way the depth and breadth of Indigenous civilization and law. I think this has come out in a number of court cases. The Nishka Treaty that came out in the 90s. These things are in the background. So what we see happening is a not one law, but we're developing a framework of being a church that allows the various communities and their various types of law to develop in a basic kind of Christian concept. And by that, I don't mean a Western Christian concept. I mean, we look to really the basic gospel values, kind of really of the first few centuries of the church, and kind of divorced from some of the more recent developments. A lot of people are pretty nervous in the Anglican Church about how this will deal with issues of jurisdiction and all of that sort of thing. The Indigenous law is based primarily on a relationship. So, and this, of course, was an issue in the making of treaties, because Indigenous treaty making was fundamentally about making relatives and relationship. And of course, Western treaty making was about making ceding law and ceding land and authority, those sorts of things. Ours has to do with relationship and with spiritual life, and that is fundamentally what it's about. We do not think there's going to be a whole lot of trouble about jurisdiction and those issues that are primary and fundamental to Western law, because we think that our organization will be on a fundamentally different basis. We intend to really be an Indigenous expression of the basic fundamentals of our church, but to be something that really hasn't existed in our church. We hope it will surprise and delight, and it'll probably be pretty messy too. But we're happy to be that, and we hope this short presentation has intrigued you, and we hope to be a recovery, a revitalization of Indigenous life that will be of service, not just to our denomination, but to all of Indigenous life in the communities that we are a part of. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, Mark and Judith, for your introduction to the conversation this evening. We have received some questions, and I'll probably have a few to pose as well. One of the things, just to pick up on quickly before we get to some of the Q&A, we're recently talking, Archbishop, about I guess some of the resistance that or fears that many in the church still have around self-determining Indigenous church. What are you finding right now are the main obstacles or misunderstandings that are the most resistant?
So let me count the ways. No, I think again, I think a jurisdiction is still the big issue, and because issues like liability and those sorts of things have become fundamental to the way institutions operate today. I think that has become difficult. Now, I've noticed that when we talk about issues, and we say to people, well, we want to be organized around relationship and spirituality, people usually get kind of ticked off, and they say, well, we do too. But I think that we want to put that as so much in the front that will shape how we do business, that will shape how we make decisions, and how we do things. So I think for many people it's really hard to imagine, and we still have a lot of people who just can't wrap their minds around it, I think, because they've only understood one way of doing this, and it's kind of it's so wrapped in a particular culture, and it's such a successful model in their minds that they just can't imagine it being done any other way. It's Christmas with figgy pudding, and what are you going to have if you don't have figgy pudding? So it's I think one person who was very supportive of us. He said, what are you going to do? Are you going to become Presbyterians or something? Or it's just hard for some people to understand that the basic principles that the Church of England used to articulate its identity can be used in another context to create another kind of identity. And I think once it happens, people will go, oh, I get it. And so it just has to happen. And then I think people will go, oh, okay. So
part of it's lack of exposure or experience at this point, which I suppose is true in terms of Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations in many pockets, or maybe swaths of the church still today.
Right. And I think, and one other thing I would say is that we're still operating with some basic prejudices, so that people have grown up in a system of ideas that sees Indigenous people as a primitive form of themselves. So they've grown up in a system of thought that says, you know, Indigenous people are back here near the Stone Age, and we are up here. You know, we are the pinnacle of creation. You know, the suburbs is what God had in mind, and we have come to, you know, we are the pinnacle of development, and I think it's very difficult for people who have had that kind of timeline built in to understand that there are more pluralistic models, and that that if you enter into a different way of looking, there's something to be learned from that. And so it's going to take some time to rewire people's minds, and it's coming. Yeah.
So maybe both you and Judith could address this. This strikes me as a follow-up question in a sense to what you were just saying from one of our participants. Basically, given the jurisdictional fear could paralyze further development of our shared reconciliation goals. Could you speak about, does the church use a consistently applied, transparent, deliberate decision-making mode? How is the church going about that kind of discussion and decision-making in a way that lessens fear rather than fuels it? Both of you, please address this.
But just go ahead, and I'll follow you. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I would say first off is, where there's a will, there's a way. Without the will, there will be no way. And notwithstanding all of the challenges that Archbishop Mark has laid out, jurisdictional fears can be overcome by commitment to progress. And I am seeing some of that. I chair the strategic planning working group in the National Church. And we've launched, during the pandemic, have launched a series of listening groups across the country just to hear what people are thinking about the church, their lives, their priorities. One of the things that has emerged from that, and guess what's at the very top of people's list of priorities? It's building the Indigenous church. So they may not be aware of all the pitfalls that the Archbishop has mentioned, but you have to start with that commitment. And I think it's building.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that, and the reality is there's still some wringing of hands, but the on the ground, you know, I have really good relationships with bishops, and I'm in conversation with a whole bunch of them, and we're talking about how we want to operate together, and it's working really well. You know, your bishop, Archbishop N, and Bishop Lydia, they have, they have the spectacular model in Thunder Bay. I think that's a prophetic piece of work, and so there's a lot of really beautiful stuff that is happening, and we have a lot of Indigenous bishops. Like we're close to a third of. I mean, we're more represented in the House of Bishops than we are in the general population. So, something good must be happening, and so I think, and we really are in a different place today than we were even 5 years ago, and especially 10 years ago, let me tell you. So, yeah.
One of the questions that's come up, or a few questions I should say that have come up, have to do with, I suppose, how this plays out on the ecumenical spectrum. One person pointing out that the United Church has grappled with many of these same issues.
Yeah.
And another person wondering if a decolonized Indigenous church should reject the plurality of Christian churches, the denominationalism, I think, essentially, and simply be Christian. Are there insights or initiatives that have been helpful from other churches in what we're doing, or how we've been helpful to others? Is it important for us to move through this with a focus on our unique communities or denominations, or is there a benefit to tackling this ecumenically as well? I don't know if you want to tackle any or all of that, but there just seemed to be a cluster of some questions around this on the ecumenical level. And
yeah,
I think especially with your role in the World Council of Churches, you might be able to speak to that. And Judith, with your experience in the Canadian landscape as well.
Yeah, I mean, so when I was in Alaska, we learned that in the denominational physics, that 50 below the denominational differences melt. So and we live in a 50 below world. So and I think that it's pretty much 50 below in Indigenous communities all the time. So I think that denominations don't mean much in Indigenous communities. The problem is, and this is true with us as well as others, is that a lot of the denominations don't have much institutional presence in Indigenous communities anymore. We don't have as much as we used to. And this is, a lot of most of our clergy are Indigenous and non-stipendiary. That's because institutionally we pulled out, and the United Church has the same kind of problem, and Presbyterians and others do as well. So we don't, but there's very few communities where there's overlap. I think that needs to be understood. So it's not like we're fighting with each other over territory. It's not like there's many communities where you have two churches in the same place. In fact, I only know of one community where that's true. So, and we get along together a lot. Now, there's a lot of places where you have Pentecostal churches and Anglican churches. Some communities where you have Roman Catholic and Anglican and Pentecostal. But people get along really, 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 really well. I mean, there's not, we don't, I think that everybody works for the community. And so I think I like that, and I believe that. And we have, our folks are very, very much committed to operating in what you would call ecumenical, but the word is, not a big word out on reserves. But so one of the biggest things, and this is an Indigenous tradition that is emerging of what used to be before Christianity and Europeans came, was the hymn singing tradition. And it emerged because Indigenous practices were outlawed, and they needed to find a way to express themselves. And hymn singing was the way to do it. It was the only way and these hymn singing traditions are very, very popular still, although they're usually called gospel jamboree. Some places they're called other things. You find them all over Canada, Alaska, United States, all over the place. But anyway, my point is, these are entirely what you would call ecumenical. Everybody comes, and they're Pentecostal, they're whatever. So, there's not nobody checks your denominational card at the door. So you're absolutely right, and we don't really think of that. It's very, very much a part of things. The denominational wars ended out there a long time ago. Yeah.
We're getting lots of great questions, so I will apologize ahead of time to folks if we can't get to all of them.
Yeah, I should talk shorter. Sorry.
I'm having a lot of fun. Oh no, that's fine. That wasn't a cue to you. That's just recognizing that this is stimulating a lot of really exciting questions, and but I don't think we're going to be able to get to them all. But there was one that was posed, Judith, that people were asking if you could provide more context around the strategy discussion and the role of the discussion that's going on. That you referred to some things afoot in the church in terms of strategy and discussion, and there's some hope that you might elaborate on that a little bit more.
Well, planning is, despite the pandemic, is important, and people who have been involved in this will sympathize with our ability to foresee the future and all of the drivers that are out there. Having said that, we do want to move ahead on some of our big files, and certainly the building of the Indigenous Church is a critical one. We've relaxed our approach to planning, strategic planning, simply because we do not know what the resource constraints are going to look like in the next couple of years. People's attendance at church, online. There are a lot of unknowns out there at this point in time. We do have to be ready for a growth scenario or a no growth scenario or something in between. So we have been looking at those. The Indigenous Church is a special case in the sense that we have our own ways of making decisions. They take time, they involve consensus, they involve consultation with the elders. And I think the larger church understands that you can't hurry that we will go at a pace that's most appropriate. A lot of people would like to see strategic change with, goals and objectives and all the nice things in there, the vision, all that spelled out, and what it's going to cost in year 1, year 2, year 3. We're not able to work like that. It's much more organic than that as a planning approach. So I don't know, Archbishop Mark, if you want to add anything to that.
No, that's good.
I'm always flattered when he thinks what I say is good.
We've got a mix of questions directly related to the church and some that are widening the scope a little bit. One directly related to church, or two, I should say, that seem to go together, potentially anyway. One of our participants asked, do you think that the European version of the church that was imposed on First Nations people created obstacles to recognizing good news in the gospel? And related to that, I think, potentially anyway, person says, building the Indigenous church, isn't that what caused all this grief in the first place? Perhaps to respectfully leave Indigenous spirituality completely alone and let them find their own renaissance. Comment. So I'm not sure if there's an understanding there that this is another European imposition or not, but those are two separate questions, but they might resonate with one another. So I'll let either or both of you take a stab at that as well.
See, I think, I was, the church as a Western institution doesn't really exist anymore out in reserves, it's been gone for a long time. Its influence is still there. It still exerts a lot of control, more than it should, really. But I think that I want to reiterate, Indigenous elders developed their own understanding of what the teachings of Jesus meant to them, that resonated with their understanding of their own way, that rejected the basic teachings of the church. So Albert Tritt, the great prophet of the Gwich'in people, said, "The way of the white man leads to death. The way of Jesus leads to life." And I think that what we have to understand, church institutions and white liberals, white conservatives for that matter, is that Indigenous people have developed their own understanding of what Jesus means. And they, when you go up north, you're going to find that they have their own way of dealing with it. And to say now, okay, you guys, be traditional again. At this point, that would be genocidal. What has happened now out in the reserves is that it's not churchianity, it's not Western, it is their own understanding of this. And what we are trying to do is to give expression to that. We are not trying to build a Western church. We are trying to build a church that is faithful to that understanding that the elders expressed underground that was persecuted. So the elders where I grew up, they had to hide their understanding of what the gospel was from the missionaries, from the priests. But you know what? When they gathered for funerals, they pulled out their tobacco pouches and they threw tobacco on the caskets. Now that was against the law, and that was their way of saying, "Okay, put us in prison." They were saying, "We will be this." And what I'm trying to say is that they had a way of resisting, and so this is what I think that a lot of non-Indigenous people don't understand, that for some Indigenous people, developing their own understanding of an Indigenous understanding of this was their way of resisting colonization. So please listen to me. One more thing. Wovoka the prophet, back in the 1800s, he had a vision. In this vision, Jesus and their ancestors were coming back in a cloud in the sky, and he brought with him these shirts that the bullets would bounce off, and the buffalo came back, and the grass came back, and the white people were pushed back into the sea. And this was the beginning of the ghost dance. It was this ghost dance that the people of Bigfoot were dancing when the 7th Cavalry came and slaughtered them at Wounded Knee. They believed in the gospel. It wasn't the gospel of the missionaries, but it was something else. And it was this gospel that we are trying to be true to, the vision of the elders. So we're not trying to impose yet again another institutional vision. We are trying to be true to the vision of the elders. I want to be clear about that.
Thank you. There's a question here too that comes to you, Judith. How are young people in their teens, 20s, and 30s engaging? This person acknowledges it's hard for the church to get their engagement at the best of times. It may be even more challenging with the residential schools as a backdrop. How are they being engaged? How are you engaging them? Or how are we as church?
Yeah, it is a challenge. We have tried different approaches to bringing young people together. Believe it or not, a lot of young people find this a really archaic technology. um, there are faster ways of communicating. We have had some input into the strategic planning process from Indigenous young people, but I don't know, Mark, if you want to add more to that. That some of the challenges that they're facing are so real and on reserves. For example, I mean, this whole massive suicide and murdered and missing Indigenous women. I mean, I know people whose daughters are missing, and so it is. Where is faith in all of this? I think young people are growing in their faith, but like every generation, they sometimes get lost for a few years and come back, and I have seen that happen as well. Do you want to add anything else to that, Mark, from the point of view
Sure.
of?
Yeah, I mean, this is what keeps us up at night. This is it's a deep struggle. We are very much in pain about our young people, and this is why we struggle, and we suffer with them. Before the pandemic, a big part of what I did was to go around and speak with young people and talk with them and try to give them a sense of hope, which is a hard sell in this sort of thing. We've been doing what we can to try to set up a community, but it's been very difficult in the midst of the pandemic, and quite, I mean, to be honest with you, it's been there's a lot of bad stuff going on in communities across Canada. A lot of overdose, attempted suicide, and suicide is going on. So it is very, very hard, and I must say that is one of our biggest challenges, and something that we deal with on a daily basis. So, yeah, it's not easy, and it's a struggle, because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a product of a system that has been designed by deliberate policy choices by Canadian governments going back hundreds of years, and we are living with the consequences, and we're trying hard to deal with it. And on a good day before the pandemic, it was very, very difficult. When you weave into it a pandemic, it's a chaos that's beyond imagination. So it's a very big struggle, very big struggle. Yeah.
I would just add too that youth need to see progress on some of these things, and the church can't do it alone. It really is going to take partnerships to really address clean drinking water and housing and some of the other really, really discouraging situations for youth. So I send out a plea on that front.
Yeah, and I would say too, what happens is we have. So what happens is that church people respond to the individual. This happens. So they'll hear of an individual community, or they'll hear of an individual person. Their heart will go out to them, and they'll say to me, "How can I help that person, or how can I help that community?" And I will try to connect them, but I will say to them, if you could get mad enough to talk to your MP and say, I am just so sick and tired of this happening, you could leverage this a lot more than your $20 bill would, you know. And I think that at some point in time we have to let our government know we cannot tolerate this anymore. And I think that that's I think that all of us and our best minds have to come together and find a way to a better way of life for all of us, and that has to be our hope. And as Judith says, there has to be a different approach. And we're not just doing this because we want to add people to our church. We want people to find hope and peace in life, but we also want to do this to contribute to the life of the community. We're not just saying, oh yeah, but we'll be fat and sassy in our church buildings. We hope to contribute to a better Canada, a better communities, and a more healthy and abundant future. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of potential for us to have a lot more conversation on just this topic. Never mind what probably set up for the rest of the series. I'm aware that we're getting into our last 10 minutes. So I'm just going to ask a couple more questions and then leave it open to you if you have other things that you'd like to say in closing. What I've been not mentioning names other than at the very beginning, but I'll mention this one too. One comes from one of your colleagues in the House of Bishops, Archbishop Mark, Bishop Priscilla Shaw, who has thanks you both for your presentations and your testimony this evening, but also asking you to speak to the racist policies that need changing in our Anglican Church, how to identify them, what needs changing. I guess a question I've been wondering about too, so I might slip it in here as well, is I became aware recently how a lot of our discussions in the church and beyond talk about either Indigenous and settlers or Indigenous and colonizers, and there are other identifiable demographics, shall we say, that we don't always name. I'm thinking, for example, people of African heritage who were not Indigenous to this continent, did not come here to make a better life, so to speak, were uprooted from their own land and made to work on stolen land. So if you could maybe have that in your mind too, as we look at what's the church doing in terms of the broader circles of reconciliation to make that a reality, or and what we need to do as a church to identify and change racist policies or even practices in our church.
Okay.
Maybe I'll start, but just to say, most people don't wake up in the morning and decide to be racist. There's so much built into our post-colonial way of life that it is hard to know where to begin. A lot of the racism that exists is inadvertent. It's not deliberate. It is embedded in structures. It's embedded in values and attitudes, norms. And so you're really talking, a wholesale revamping of how we think about race. I know some of my former colleagues in the federal government, that was something that we were working at for a long time. But the policies themselves were not designed to be racist. The manifestation of them may well be. And so we really have to take a holistic approach to addressing issues of race. And you're quite right, Jay, to point out the Black Lives Matter link. We do share a lot in terms of tackling some of these really fundamental issues. Anyway, I'll just stop there, Mark, and let you carry on.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that was pretty short, Judith. Anyway, so I was a number of years ago. I was in Minneapolis. My brother was at the time very, very ill, and I met Webster Tuhawk, one of the great Lakota priest from South Dakota, and his wife was there with cancer, and we met in the hall, and I was so happy to see him. I knew about his wife, and we talked for a little bit, and it was really great. And I said, well, do you have a place to stay? And he said, yeah, I'm staying here in the hospital. And he said, yeah, it's right around the corner. And then he smiled and he said, let me show it to you, And we walked around, and it said family room on it. It had a big sign, family room. And then he opened the door, and there was one little bed there, and we both looked at it and laughed because, for any Indigenous family, there's a lot more than one little bed is gonna, And so the whole point of it was that this was not designed for a Lakota family. It was, and that was the whole point. Is that there's a lot of things that are designed in this with other people in mind, and so a lot of racism is inadvertent. I would say most of it is, and most of it is hidden from view. Most of it is unconscious, and a lot of it is held by Indigenous people as well. As I gave the example, an Indigenous person saying, "Do we have law?" Well, of course we do, and so as every people does, look in the Bible. It says in the Bible, every people has law, and so this. These attitudes, which have been implanted, encoded in the way people think and act, these things have been encoded in the way in which people do things and say things, and in the way in which people operate, so that, for instance, as the larger society has developed the rules and procedures that are in place to oversee the training and vetting of people for ordination, are geared towards what happens in the larger society. They don't have anything to do with the common experience of Indigenous people, or for that matter, most ethnic minorities. And so they exclude people. They're not deliberately designed to exclude people, but they exclude people. And they do this in a way. So they create this this ceiling that's invisible to the people who impose the ceiling, but is painfully visible to the people who are excluded. And this is the process that we're going through in the life of the church. How do we help people to see this in a way that isn't too jarring? Because many Canadians, especially, and a lot of Anglicans, their identity is based on this idea that we're fair. We're not like those guys south of the border that had the riot in the capital. We're nice to everybody and that sort of thing, and so their identity disintegrates when you say, your procedures are unfair. Your procedures exclude people, and this is this feeling of disintegration often creates feelings of fear, inadequacy, anger, and so we're fighting against these things. This is how we and we have to move forward. One final thing that I would say. So Elijah Harper I got to know him before he passed away. He was a great person. He had a vision, and he said the elders had a vision that this land was so great that you could welcome people from all over the world, and that they could come together, and that we could build a land on justice for all people that would recognize the special contribution of First Peoples, but that all people would be welcomed here, and that we could build a great society for everybody that would be good for our children and grandchildren. He said, to anybody who would listen, that's our original vision. And so this would be on the foundation of racial equity and goodness. And so everybody come to this place and receive the goodness of the land, but it has to be an abundant land for all people, especially there has to be honor and dignity for the First Peoples, and there has to be justice for all people and all races and ethnicities. This is the vision that Elijah Harper had, and I think it's the vision for all of us today.
Thank you so much. I wish we had more time. We're down to our last 3 or 4 minutes, and we've got questions ranging anywhere from how what we're doing and what you've been sharing could inform the society writ large, or even relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous elsewhere in the world. We've had some people making statements about things that hopefully you'll be able to see. I've tried to clip them, and I think you'll probably have access to the Q&A so you can look at that later. We had one person wondering about the kinds of funding, especially Indigenous-led funding, and offered some assistance with that from the UN. So there are some really good comments and questions that I'll make sure you see. And I do apologize to people for not getting to all of them, because some of them I was really looking forward to hearing the answers to as well. But when you have 1 hour and 15 minutes, you can't do them all. But I really am so excited what you've shared. If in the last minute or two we have, if you could each just, if you have a closing thought or word, and then I'll turn things back over to Elizabeth Kingston. Judith, we'll let you go first again.
Well, we are engaged in a huge experiment, and we don't often look around to see what others are actually doing. But I would certainly welcome people who want to talk to us about what we're doing, can learn from us, and perhaps we can also learn from others in how they're tackling reconciliation.
Archbishop, anything that you'd like to part with?
Well, I would say amen to what Judith said. That was pretty good. I don't think I can top that. Yeah. Yeah.
It's been a privilege to talk with both of you, and to multitask, reading questions and listening to you at the same time. It's I really appreciate this opportunity to be with both of you. So I thank both of you, and I thank the CIC. And Elizabeth, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Jay. And I'd like to say what a privilege it's been to be with all of you. I like to thank you very much, Archbishop Mark and Judith and Jay, for a really thoughtful and fascinating discussion. And as you can see by the questions that Jay was referring to, that it's generated just tremendous interest. And thank you very much for that. We'll make sure that you will see the questions, and it really is such a broad array. I'd like to thank Carolina and Sam as well for their technical support this evening. And if I may just borrow your line, Archbishop Mark, we should hold in our hearts, and I'd say not the temperature, but the sense that when it's 50 below, differences tend to melt. So I think that's really a wonderful line that I won't forget, certainly. So I just sort of in closing, let's begin with the commitment, as Judith had said. Let's all learn to walk together with honor and dignity, and so appreciate all the wonderful expressions that have come out of this evening. So thank you very much. And thank you all those who have engaged with all of us in this conversation this evening. So good evening to everyone, and miigwech. Good night.
Miigwech. Thank you. Thank you.